Hello and welcome to the Brand Retro podcast. Today, we're going to be kind of kicking it old school and going really retro today. And we're going to talk about Chuck Jones and everything that's going on in the legacy of the great artist Chuck Jones with his grandson, Greg Kausen. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me. I always enjoy talking about my grandfather and all of the things that not only are happening, but have happened in the past. So everybody brings something different. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my personal experience with the Chuck Jones Gallery is that I was on a work trip, man, must have been 10, 15 years ago, and I had about 2, 3 hours to kill before a plane. And I found your gallery, and I believe it was in San Diego. And I must have been in there 2, 3 hours just walking around. Almost missed my plane, didn't, but just kind of walking around and looking at everything. And I was just completely kind of drawn into the whole process of not only that, you had these things on display and it was an art gallery type setting, but kind of the mission and the background behind what you guys were doing to keep the art kind of alive and relevant. Can you tell me a little bit about how that process got started and kind of where that idea came from?
Absolutely. First of all, I do understand about getting consumed into a gallery or an art exhibition or a museum. It happens to me all the time. It seems to be one of my favorite pastimes is to go into places and just experience it because when you put artwork on the walls, it tells a story, and everybody sees that story and hears that story and experiences that story differently. So being a part of that, and the gallery you were in San Diego has moved, but it's still down there now. It's in Little Italy. But the I am very good at math. I'm an engineer by training, and when you said I had 2 hours to kill and I spent 3 hours in there, I'm thinking that's the best story ever. That you missed the plane because you're in a Chuck Jones space. And but in general, I've had a unique opportunity to start a few different things, Chuck Jones, and going way back. I mean, obviously, my grandfather started in animation back in the early 1930s and went through Warner Brothers from around 33 to 63, and then continued on for decades, continuing to animate with Chuck Jones Enterprises, MGM, and the like. But as far as the galleries and the museum exhibitions, my mother really started the business of Chuck's artwork publishing in 1977. And so she is really credited not just with the Chuck Jones legacy of artwork, but really animation artwork in general. Although there are a few things from Disney that were offered up with Cavassier and some other things throughout the years, she was the one with my grandfather coming up with the concept of doing signed limited editions, particularly from these greats who really created the artwork, created the cartoons, whether they be at Disney or Warner Brothers back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and whatnot. And so gallery business or the art publishing business started in the late 70s. And then I was, as I fondly say, was sucked into the family business in the early 90s, actually to automate the company. Computer engineer by training and by profession way back when. Then I was given the opportunity through some things that were going on with Warner Brothers at the time in the early 90s with studio stores and whatnot to open art galleries, the Chuck Jones galleries. So I just sort of stumbled into it, was thrust into it, whatever it was. And then as we grew from Corona Del Mar down into Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then San Diego, and then we've done pop-up galleries in San Francisco and Palm Desert and Florida and Oregon and whatnot, and it continues to spread. That the idea of having that experience in the fine art gallery world, it certainly wasn't ours. I mean, Chuck's artwork was represented in circle galleries way back when, starting in the early 80s until they closed in the 90s, in Gallery Lanesburg, Catalog, and other fine art galleries throughout the world, truly. But I think the sort of the next iteration started when the Chuck Jones Center for Creativity, which is a 501c3 public charity, was founded in 1999 while Chuck was still alive with the the impetus. And it wasn't. And people ask, was it, is this sort of the dream of Chuck? And Chuck didn't. I would say he gave his blessing about the idea, and it really was my mother and me sitting one day sharing stories about Chuck's inspiration, and like you talked about, Mike, to go in and experience something and get the story and understand and how it hits you, your personal memories that we would come across through traveling with Chuck to art shows and presentations. I had the privilege of traveling with him up to Lucas Ranch one time, Skywalker Ranch, and then lectures at ILM, and all of these younger animation professionals that really took it to this new level at Industrial Light and Magic and other studios that would have these stories, as well as just sort of the random people who would come across Chuck or we'd be around and would tell an inspiration either of meeting him or seeing his cartoons, reading his works, and being inspired by him and his philosophies and his cartoons. And these stories continued to ripple through. So during that time in early 1999, these stories were filtering out, and those others that were around had their own personal stories of, oh yeah, I remember this and that. And how do we perpetuate that? I think that was part of it. And somebody said, well, if you're going to do it right, and start a nonprofit. And in this case, Chuck Jones Center for Creativity, which really got its name right around that 2000, 2001, because there was this discussion of, what is the core of Chuck Jones? Because everybody talks about his animation. Certainly they know the Looney Tunes characters. They know Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Roadrunner, Wile E, Coyote, Marvin Martian, all of these characters that whether he personified or created, but he certainly directed them over those 30 years at Warner Brothers. Then he's got his fine art, he's got his philosophies, he's got all these different things. And the word that kept coming back was creativity, that the man lived in a creative space. He immersed himself. And one of the things that he talked about at times, or heard from him over those years, and he passed away in 2002. So I got nearly 40 years with him. So I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time around him. That he talked about byproducts of finding creativity. And he said, everybody's got that creative spirit inside. Everybody's got that unique creative genius inside. And that passion, joy, and curiosity are all byproducts of finding that creative spirit, that unique thing. And I think we can all, once it starts to kind of percolate up, you're like, oh, right. And so I see it as this delving down into this creative genius that each of us has inside, and that all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, what about that idea? What about, oh, this is what I want to do or be in this moment. And that joyous feeling that sort of tingles throughout us, when I am around the programs that we do with the Center for Creativity with young people who are given the opportunity to do this, or wandering through an art gallery, and finding that in that smile, that laughter, that memory that percolates up. That is what the Chuck Jones, let's call it the Chuck Jones brand, really is. And it's come to, it continues to find its way into communities around the country and truly around the world. That this experience, and I although I'm a custodian of it, I am in essence kind of like, all right, I'm going to hold on to as this flows, and then when it needs assistance to sort of keep going, I'm there, and the family is there, and those who volunteer with us all over the place are there to foster it a little bit more, and then it takes off again in so many different ways. So it's a very long answer to a very short question, but there's, as being around it and experiencing it, that it's like an unbridled stallion that is just like, okay, we're going.
The two things that stood out to me, like when I was there and like almost made me miss my plane, but the two things that stood out to me was the one was the peek behind the curtain, so to speak. So like there were some original artworks there, some sketch drawings and some of those things. And for me, that was a huge thing because I have an art background, and I actually used to, I guess I'd call him a mentor, but I used to kind of work underneath a different artist locally, and he would talk about Chuck Jones, Frederick Remington, Norman Rockwell, these different artists, and I was kind of educated on that kind of genre of artists. And being I grew up during that time, I remember all the Bugs Bunny cartoons, the Grinch Who Stole Christmas. I remember all that stuff. So to connect those dots and then, fast track it 15, 20 years later, end up at that gallery and get to see some of those original works and those sketches and these different things, it was like just an amazing experience to kind of see kind of what went into it and kind of peek inside the mind's eye of the guy who created it. Which, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like, during those early ages of comic books, animation, basically from the 20s, 30s, and on to the probably 60s, you know, the art gig and being a creator like that was a tough gig. It wasn't necessarily, a lot of people didn't consider it art because if it wasn't hanging in a gallery, it wasn't respected in the same way as, some of those other, mainstream artists were. So if you were a comic artist, a cartoonist, it just didn't carry the same weight. And now in today's culture, we are definitely identifying and giving those artists credit for what they did and the influence they had on pop culture. Would you agree with that?
Uh, Without a doubt, you said it very precisely. I believe that well, first of all, most of the studios that were creating cartoons back then were small studios. Disney was really the exception in a lot of ways, where they were doing these monstrous, wonderful, economically successful feature films, and Snow White really changed the world of animation, both inside and outside. That people were like, wow, this is a film, it's not just a cartoon. And whereas Warner Brothers was all about the short subject, they were about the filmmaking of the live action films, and the cartoons were really just a byproduct of, we need more in a picture show. And you're thinking, if you think back of when they all started in the late 20s and the early 30s with the short subjects that were done even before Leon Schlesinger started, that the short subjects would go out as a lead in to the feature film, and then people would come in and they'd want to show, because unlike today where you go into a theater and they try to play it as many times as possible, people expected for the 10 cents or the 5 cents that they paid way back when to go into a theater something that was a full show entertainment. And so those that worked for Warner Brothers were not paid well, and certainly Chuck started. He was not one of the guys that started actually working for less than nothing, meaning that there were later on, after Chuck kind of started in the early 30s, there was a period of time, and I've heard the story from other Warner Brothers folks who were there at the time, that literally, if they wanted to get into the business, they would pay Leon to work so that they would learn. It was almost like a paid apprenticeship of their own payment. And one story from a guy said that he remembers, and I don't remember the person's name, but someone that I recognized. He said that he came home from work and talked to his wife, and he said, "I finally get to work for free." And so, meaning that he didn't have to pay to work anymore, and then eventually working into getting paid and whatnot. But, those guys, even the directors back in the 30s and 40s, did not make much money at all. It got better over time, but a lot of them were making, next to nothing to make these things. And Leon was a very wealthy man. He was a very successful businessman. He understood the economics of it well. And I know his great nephew Robert Schlesinger, and they talk about as their family that he kept it together during the Depression and during the war, the early parts of the war and whatnot. So there was it wasn't a given that that a business like that would survive, because it wasn't a guarantee, and the filmmaking was certainly different, and how long was going to last, that they were going to pay X amount of money for these Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons to go with it, because and then in the 40s when it transitioned over to Warner Brothers, they were really a second class citizen, as far as even when they moved them on the lot in 1955. They set up a studio over there where they moved into from down in the Hollywood area that there were prior to that. And they made the animation building, and that building's still there. I think it's accounting or publicity or something these days. But it's not on the regular tour. You have to actually tell somebody it was behind the old Western town, and they used to have a fence there, and they wouldn't let the animation guys onto the regular lot. So they would they'd have to have their own area and whatnot. So they're sort of second class citizens way back when as well. But it really wasn't until the 70s, I think, when people looked at the historical development of these cartoons. Like you said, they were seen as these films, these cartoons, these sort of add-on, bolt-on extras for a theater. And then people started to go, wow, that was a transformative time from the 30s through the 60s for animation, and that the people that were working on it had a unique opportunity to really be creative. And I think one of the things that Chuck talked about, and he certainly was definitive about it, was that one of the reasons that they were so good at what they did, especially after the number of years, was that there was an absolute discipline to it. That Leon, and then afterwards, there was a requirement to deliver a certain number of cartoons every year. However, and Leon, as Chuck said, he was the requirement was a 6-minute cartoon to go into the theater. So the theater owners, presenters, would not take less than a 6-minute cartoon, and he said Leon was too cheap to pay for more than 6 minutes. So there was this discipline of, you have to deliver a 6-minute cartoon. And the way that those films were made, and as you said, seeing some of those early development sketches and the process of how they were done, that each of those 6-minute cartoons would take anywhere between 6 to 9 months to make. However, each unit, and there were usually 3 units at Warner Brothers at a given time with their own directors who really ran their unit. So early on you had Tex Avery, and then Chuck started to direct in late 1937 for his first film that was released in 1938. You had Friz Freleng there. You had Bob Clampett early on, who then left in the early 40s. Bob McKimson later on, but they each had their unit, and they would have to deliver 6 to 10 films a year, and that was just the requirement. So the discipline was coming up with the process and the stories, the timing, everything to get it done efficiently and cheaply for Leon's benefit, so that they could deliver their cartoons on a regular manner. So as a studio, they delivered about 30 cartoons a year to Warner Brothers, and then in Warner Brothers ongoing. Those who are good at math kind of go, wait a minute, if they take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to make, and yet they're making 6, 8, 10 of them a year, how does that work? And when I was growing up, I remember Chuck used to talk about Disney being the Cadillac of the cartoon industry, of the animation industry, and that really that Warner Brothers was more of the Ford, sort of that Model T sort of thing. And I thought at the time, he just thought I thought it was this quality difference. And later, it was actually after he passed away, I saw a documentary on Henry Ford and really what he brought to manufacturing and this production line process. And yes, it may have been a reference of Chuck on that sort of mentality of how they made the cartoons, but I think more so it was the production line process that they employed, where for 5 weeks the writer would work on a storyboard, someone like Mike Maltese or Ted Pierce, and they would work with the director on coming up with the gags and coming up with the storyline and whatnot. And then that film would move into layout, so and timing. And so Chuck, in this case, would then take the storyboards and start to time out the film and create some of those layout drawings that you saw down in San Diego, to where he would time out the film down to a 24th of a second. And the detail, think about that, having to come up with the vision, time it out to where the dialogue and each of the pieces of animation and motion and whatnot would be timed out in Chuck's mind and then on paper. And he would do 400 or 500 layout drawings that would then be given to the animators for another 5 weeks. And so they would have this, but while he was doing layout, another story would start. So it would go through this production line process where they would move the films through and have these things end, and some of them were shorter than others, and eventually they would be animated, and then they would be inked and painted, and then they would be laid over the backgrounds and shot, and this whole process that would go on within there. And so, each of the parts at Warner Brothers had their little area. They would share the ink and paint. Some of the animators would move back and forth, but really the director was the head of his unit. He would have one or two story people that would work on different films. He would have a layout background designer. They'd have a background painter that was sort of shared between different units, and then the inkers and painters would go about doing that. And then a cameraman that was given, and then they had all of the music that was done. You get Carl Stalling and Milt Franklin, who then complemented it all, and they had the Warner Brothers, LA Symphony Orchestra, all of that. So I just sort of paint a picture that this behind the scenes, it really was the below the surface iceberg that you never know about. And so I think that's the most fun for us, not just a family, but in sort of the seeing what it has taken, what it took them to do to create a 6-minute film with nearly 5,000 animation drawings, sometimes dozens of backgrounds, all of that attention to detail, so it comes out looking effortless, was an art form. So what you're talking about, that all of a sudden in the 70s, people were like, wow, that is true art. And those people that worked on it were artists. They weren't just craftspeople that were pumping out, byproducts and whatnot. So, and then really over the last 50 years, the understanding and appreciation of it as an art form. And as Chuck talked about, one of the three true American art forms in a lot of ways, with the animated cartoon, jazz, and the Broadway show, that those are really intrinsically American art forms that started in the 20th century and are still living on today. So for us to be able to share those types of things, it's an honor, and I love hearing the stories of someone like yourself who went in and was like, wow, this is, I get a peek behind the curtain is a perfect way to describe it. I appreciate that a lot.
To add on what you were saying, I mean, that's the part I find fascinating about not only Chuck specifically, but that area of the country, is that there was no social media, there was no internet, these things were not getting blown up, and as well polished as it looks today, as far as like the processes and how they did all this stuff and they managed all these different things, guys like Chuck, the Jack Kirbys of the world, the Tex Averys, the Stan Lees, you even mentioned, the Ford comparison. These guys were in many ways rebels. They were innovators. They were entrepreneurs. I don't know that they ever would have gave themselves those titles, because they were just problem solvers. They were just figuring it out. But when you look back at some of the things that they were doing, it's insane to think about the deadlines and the overall weight of what it was that they were trying to accomplish, even if they had the game plan, but they didn't. They were inventing and innovating as they went, and then still knocked it out of the park, which is crazy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That they were making it up as they went along. There was no path, and certainly the earliest ones. Frizz was there well before Chuck was, and directing early on, and so was Tex Avery at Warner Brothers, and so they were really developing a lot of the processes. Chuck came in '33 and started to animate for Tex, and then sort of worked his way up. And I mean, I always put it in perspective of, that yes, it's 100 years ago, or 90 years ago. I'm thinking of him in art school, and then into the animation world like 90 years ago. But I also look at it as where he was in his life. That where how old was he? And he was about 18 when he started in animation. He had just gone to Chenard Art Institute for the 3-year fine arts program there, and that's what he dreamed of being, was a traditional fine artist. And there's a couple of videos of him talking about that he was miserable in high school, and his father took him out at 15 and put him into Chenard, and that he was really probably the youngest guy there, and people like Millard Sheets in his 20s were there. So these incredible artists, and it was really the epitome of West Coast art academy, art school back then. And he came out of art school in late 29 and 1929, which was right at the beginning of the Depression. And that really, he stumbled into the animation business. And although he had this incredible training, the animation industry wasn't an industry. It was, he kind of messed around for a while on Alvera Street, drawing caricatures and trying to make things happen. But then he got a job at Iworks Studios, actually being a cell washer, and he was hired in to wash the cells that we all revere as parts of history, because it was cheaper to pay him really next to nothing to clean off the ink and clean off the paint and reuse the acetate, the nitrate, the early products, the clear stuff that they put under the camera, than it was to buy the new ones for 8 cents. And so, that's how he got in originally. And then he finally became an assistant animator. And what's funny, the timing of such, I had a conversation with my mother this week. And so the timing of this is pretty awesome. That I knew that my grandfather met my grandmother while working. She was older than he, and she passed away in the '70s. But they met, and it turns out that my grandmother was the executive assistant of Iworks. So she was a well-educated woman out of the University of Oregon, and had been in the industry, worked for studios, was and in a lot of ways ran the studio, because Ugg was a creative who used to be at Disney and started his own venture. And so she was working there, hired Chuck, hired my grandfather. They knew each other back then. But then I guess, and Chuck talks about this, that I guess he wasn't really quite diligent enough, and really wasn't that good at his job and whatnot. So not only did she hire him, she fired him. And so at UB, and so later they started to date, and then eventually got married. And my mother was born in 1937. So I didn't put it all together that it was his first job. Chuck coming in at 18, and I think she was 5 or 6 years older than he was. And so I'm sure he was just like, oh, great, I'm getting hired into this, and now I'm getting fired. And he actually did tell the story that he went back to visit some of his friends at UB, and UB came in and looked at him and said, you're not doing your job, you're fired. He said, you can't fire me. And he said, why? He says, I don't work here anymore. So he had this sort of history, and then hired on in '33 with Leon's unit and really kind of buckled down and decided that he wanted to be a part of this industry and learned from people like Tex. He said that Tex was really the critical factor on learning how to direct and how to create character, how to create the right movement and the timing. And if you look back at, he started to direct at the age of 24. Disney was the old man in the industry at 30. So these were young, really young people who started something out of, I guess, a necessity that film in the theaters was new, and found a way to communicate. And, as we talked about before, in this case, was really left alone at Warner Brothers to do what they wanted to do. They could develop the characters that they wanted to. They could, share characters like Bugs Bunny, because Chuck had directed Elmer's Candid Camera in early 1940 and released that. And then it wasn't until July that Tex's Wild Hare got released, where it really named Bugs Bunny. But that bunny had been used by different directors for a number of years prior to that. And then Bugs Bunny evolved based upon each of the directors. And Tex took Bugs in a crazy, wacky way. Bob Clampett took them in a sort of that Tex Avery direction. Frizz took him in a different direction. Chuck, over the next 20 years and beyond, took him in a different direction. So, they although they had to get past the censors, because you think about a bunch of young, creative, mostly men. Certainly, there were women that were involved in that process with animation and ink and paint and all the rest. But that there was a lot of humor that was being thrown around, and not all of it got by the censor. So, but other than that, they could kind of work their own world. And like I think you also mentioned, there was no feedback other than internal viewings, which they would do for every film, where they would all sit around and be able to see a new film that was coming out. It certainly wasn't. There was no social media. There was no feedback loop to find out if this was a popular one. And unlike films, which either had money coming in for it or not, that was the success of a movie and critical acclaim. The cartoons were just there. No one ever started ranking them and going, oh, that was a great film, until much later with the Academy and whatnot. So one of the greatest things to inspire creativity was that they needed to do it for themselves, because they had no direct feedback on whether or not people enjoyed them. They figured, if we do it so we like them as our team and our studio and the groups that were involved in there, then we hoped that others would enjoy them. And obviously, over the years, it's proved positive that what they liked, I think we all come to appreciate and like.
Well, I appreciate the time again.
All right. Thanks so much, Mike.
If you'd like to learn more about Cyberdogs, share your thoughts, or even ask a specific question about this episode and or the brand Retro Mindset, contact me directly at mike@cyberdogsmarketing.com.